Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm finally going to be covering my BT6 tier list. I know, better late than never, am I right? So the reason why this was so late compared to some of my other tier lists was because I actually wanted to have all of the decks laid out before you in video form, or at least the vast majority of them, so that way if you're ever curious on what a deck is doing, you could just look at my BT6 playlist and find one of the decks that are on here in that playlist. So that's kind of why everything was so late, is because I was just working on covering as many decks as I possibly can for you, so that way you have a reference point in case you don't understand what I'm talking about. But first, before I get into the tier list, just another disclaimer. This is my personal opinion on what I think the meta is going to look like at the beginning of BT6. Keep in mind, metas do tend to change based on player preference and what region you're in, because regions also have differences on how they want to play and what they prioritize. One big thing to also keep in mind when using Japanese data is the fact that we can only use it for so much, because essentially Japanese data is inaccurate because it is best of ones at local level events. So they don't have huge events like we do over in various other regions. So their events are a lot more smaller, and there's a lot more that they could get away with just because they are, well, best of one and it's a smaller sized event. So we can only use that data as a barometer for more popularity rather than validity of what the deck can actually do. But with all of that aside, here is my BT6 tier list. So on tier 1, I don't necessarily think any one of these decks is better than the other. Well, I lied, I do, but I'm not placing them in any particular order just because I think they're all categorized as a tier 1 deck. So to start things off, we have Black Royal Knights. So Black Royal Knights, for all intents and purposes, is basically replacing what Black Toolbox was doing in BT5, because it's doing almost the exact same thing, well, but better. So what Black Royal Knights is doing that's making it better is it just has lots of more tools to be interacting with the opponent's field, and that level of interaction just ups the overall power of what the deck is going to be doing. So you have Craniumon to act as some defense and protection, you have Genkumon to act as some more removal and some extra security damage when we need it, and then on top of that we also have Alphamon to act as a good defensive card coming out of our security, and just a solid card to be using to aggress with, just because we could use him in various different ways based on his different abilities. So between the 3 Royal Knights that you could be playing in the deck, it's just looking like a very strong deck, on top of the fact that Black got a lot of good generic tools to be using to not only just help its overall aggression, but to help its overall control aspects, just because we have more removal options and solid tamers to be using to help complement what the deck is trying to do, making it just a very solid tier 1 deck to be picking up. Next, we have Security Control. Oh boy, Security Control is one of the decks that just does not go away, just because the concept of playing with the security abilities and forcing them to come out is just that good. The deck is mainly based around recovery and removal, and we got, well, even more removal cards to be playing around with, and we have a whole bunch of variants on how we could play the deck with a whole bunch of different color combinations, just because, well, it's still doing the same type of thing of just recover and removal. So those two things are just very, very powerful, and it's looking not so much to try to attack the opponent's security all at once, like a lot of the other decks on this list. It's looking for a more chip style and grind approach that also could lead to deck out situations. So there's that aspect of playing into it too, just the fact that it's so hard to kill because of the removal and the recovery abilities that it's playing around with. Next up, we have Jesmon. So Jesmon is basically Lord Nightmon 2.0, except it's in red, so it could actually deal damage on top of being able to play free bodies that also have various other abilities for utility's sake. So you have Jesmon that could punch really, really hard, have piercing, could hit the opponent's Digimon, could bypass the opponent's security if you play a delicate plan. Like, it could just do a lot to be a very powerful deck, and the big thing that Lord Nightmon was kind of lacking was just the punch factor that actually can close out games. So the fact that you could use it Jesmon to multi-swing, hit lots of security relatively safely while playing free buddies that are also getting you additional value is just all very, very good and very, very powerful, making him one of the best decks to pick up in BT6. Next up, we have Gabumon Bond of Friendship. So Gabumon Bond of Friendship is definitely one of the better decks to be playing in BT6 because it's essentially Rookie Rush 2.0. So what the deck is doing is you're just trying to gain lots of value off of your Tamers and your Gabumons to do various different things to try to get into Gabumon Bond of Friendship as easily and efficiently as you possibly can, while trying to chip away at the opponent's security, so that way when you actually do warp from a level 3 to a level 7, you could use that level 7 to try to close out the game, and even if you can't use that level 7 to close out the game, if they can't hit you and you're able to reload your combo, then you just combo off again and potentially kill the opponent. So it's just a very hyper-aggressive style of deck, one of the best aggro decks we have in the format, and that's making it, obviously, one of the best decks to play. Next up, we have Bond of Courage. So Bond of Courage is doing something very similar to Gabumon Bond of Friendship, where it's basically Rookie Rush 2.0, except it's not exactly Rookie Rush 2.0, just because there's a lot of control aspects and elements to what the deck is doing. So you have lots of good removal that you could run in your security to make them hitting your security really, really fearful, on top of the fact that you also can punch really hard on your lower levels, just because Red has Agumon and Greymon synergy that allow it to DP boost itself and hit for multiple security attacks. Then on top of that, you also do have your own warp from your Agumons to Bond of Courage, and Bond of Courage is just a very strong card just because he's acting, again, as some more removal, and when he removes a card, he'll also burn the opponent's security while probably doing a security check all at the same time. So it's just another very strong deck to be playing around with as a result, just because it could do lots of various different things depending on how you build it and how it's going to be ran. And then the last deck in Tier 1 is going to be Three Musketeers. So there's a couple of different color variants that you could play with Three Musketeers. You could play black or purple base. I think purple base is a little bit stronger than black base, but black base has its own pros and cons. But regardless, at the end of the day, you're just playing your Three Musketeers to basically act like pseudo-security control, where your Three Musketeers will allow you to play your options for free, and almost all of your options are going to be control-type options to try to, well, manage what the opponent can and can't do, and try to respond to what the opponent is doing. So Bellastarmon is going to be one of the most important cards in that deck, where you're just using her with all of your other Three Musketeers to gain lots of additional value, playing Megas for essentially free or reduced because you have a warp potential on your own with the Deputymon into some of your other Three Musketeers. So it's a pretty flexible and versatile deck that can handle lots of different situations and is actually trying to close out the game, unlike Security Control, just because you don't have the recovery aspects that you're dipping into to try to play this long game approach. So you are actually trying to close out the game while controlling and manipulating the opponent's field, and that's still just making it a very strong deck just because you have easy access to lots of various different removal options. Next, going into Tier 2. So Tier 2, we have Hexablaumon. So Hexablaumon is actually a decent deck now because he has a Zulongmon and some more support cards to, well, actually close out the game. So one of the big problems that Hexablaumon was facing before was he was a really good card with no way to actually close out the game, similar to Lord Nightmon. Lord Nightmon just struggled really hard closing out games because it couldn't deal damage fast enough, and now that Zulongmon is acting as the big punch factor for what Hexablaumon is trying to do, it's still a very strong deck to be using, just because you are playing it almost like a control/OTK deck, just because you're using Hexablaumon to set up your Zulongmon, and then your Zulongmon will just come in and hit really, really hard. So it is kind of like a 1-2 punch. It does require, for the most part, both Megas in order to really close out the game, but it's very easy for Blue to manage its card draw and manipulate the memory to get to that state, and attacking the opponent's inheritables actually could put them off of their game plan depending on what they're trying to do and what cards they're using. So it's still just a very good card to be using, just because also stun locking the opponent's Digimon, depending on how they're playing, is still that good, even though he still does have the weakness of when he's removed, then he kind of falls flat, but that's where Zulongmon starts to pick up the slack and is allowing you to actually use their board again in order to punch the opponent really, really hard. So I think that all of the new tools gave Hexablaumon a lot more validity in order to stick around for this coming meta. Next up, we have Lord Nightmon. So Lord Nightmon, for the most part, really didn't change. It's still just a really strong deck just because it's accruing lots of value, just because you're swinging playing bodies for free, and one of those bodies could be a level 5, and that level 5 could start removing, so you could dip into like lots of DP reduction and removal aspects on what the deck is trying to do, and you're just allowing yourself to play your cards super hyper efficient, allowing you to spawn multiple megas on board, allowing you to just create a very wide and hard board for the opponent to deal with, and well, that wide and hard board is a little bit weaker now just because there is lots of removal to try to deal with a wider board, but the fact that it's still just a very powerful presence that they have to deal with is still what's making Lord Nightmon really good, even though there are more answers to it now than there was in the past. Next, we have Green Nidhoggmon. So Green Nidhoggmon, again, is another deck that really doesn't change just because Green in BT06 didn't really get better. The best things you got in green is basically Ancient Troymon and the hybrids, just because you actually, well, have hybrids, and Ancient Troymon's ability to suspend the opponent's Digimon for them attacking is basically what Rosemon wanted to do, but better. That also could spawn a hybrid if you are playing that direction. So usually when you're playing your hybrids, Mimi just becomes useless towards the mid to late stages of the game, just because you're already turboing out your raising area. And then once you're done with your raising area, then Mimi just sits on the field and does nothing. And now you have Arbormon to just act as a card to help not only close out games, but to actually utilize your Mimis in a more meaningful way post their initial use. So I think between Nidhoggmon and Ancient Troymon, they're just two very strong cards that the deck wants to be using. But for the most part, again, the deck really hasn't changed, and you're probably going to be using Refleximon as your third mega for the deck, just because Refleximon's stun lock ability to stop the opponent from aggressing is still just really, really valuable. Next, we have Titamon. So Titamon basically replaces where Chaos Gallantmon was in the previous meta, just because Titamon does, well, almost the exact same thing, but better. So what he's playing with isn't necessarily self-sacrificing synergies, he's actually playing around with self-discarding synergies, and we have lots of powerful cards that either A, want to be discarded, or B, just are discarded to help set up our trash to make more powerful plays later and more consistent plays later, just because he's interacting with what purple was already doing, which was utilizing lots of card draw and discard abilities, and now we have even more of those to be playing with, and Titamon is basically a one-man army better than what Chaos Gallantmon was doing before, just because he has the ability where when we discard a card, he'll give himself plus 2000 DP and security tech plus 1, allowing you to even try to OTK with him and just be a very powerful card, while also spawning a level 4 or lower body that you actually do get its on play abilities with. So there's just a lot for this card to be interacting with for purple as a whole, making it the premier purple deck coming out of BT06. Next, we have Lilith Loop. So Lilith Loop doesn't go away, it actually gets better just because Titamon introduces lots of draws and discard abilities and rewards for being discarded, and Lilith Loop is a deck that could take advantage of that because Lilith Loop is basically a combo deck where the whole idea is you're just trying to set up this very intricate combo to play Lilithmon and Omnimon Swart, and then you're just going to create a very wide and very big, large board out of nowhere relatively quickly, just because we do have easier ways to set up our cards and our combos and dig through our deck even more efficiently than we did before. So Lilith Loop, even though the core strategy isn't really changing, it's still a very powerful strategy to be incorporating in a purple deck, just because purple has lots of combo potential, and BT06 adds more combo potential to what it was already doing. And then lastly, on tier 2, we have D-Brigades. Yes, D-Brigades is a actual deck that's still good, and because Black got lots of new and powerful generic tools, it only makes D-Brigades better, on top of the fact that D-Brigade could splash in a whole bunch of other tech cards from a whole bunch of other colors to do various different things, basically acting as what Rookie Rush wants to be doing, except with the added resilience of what Black is offering. So Black for a long time was just a slightly underutilized color just because its tools weren't necessarily there, and now that Black's tools are getting fleshed out, it only makes a lot of Black decks just better to use as a whole, making D-Brigades just that much better because it's interacting with On Delete, and part of what Black is trying to do within BT6 is interact with On Delete. So it's only natural that D-Brigades will get better just because it's interacting with a lot of cards that are good in BT6. Alright, next on to Tier 3. Starting off with Tier 3, we have Imperial Dramon. So Imperial Dramon is another deck that just does not want to seem to go away. This is probably the worst format to play Imperial Dramon in, just because there are better decks to play that are doing almost the exact same thing as Imperial Dramon. So Imperial Dramon is still just very powerful because his core combo is just that good still. It's just he is a little bit slower and he doesn't hit as hard as some of the other decks. Plus, there's lots of different ways to play around Imperial Dramon now more than ever, on top of the fact that, again, other decks just are moving faster. So if you're going to be running like a big combo multi-swing turn, then it is just better and more efficient and more powerful to play something like Gabu Bond of Friendship versus a slower take on what that style of deck is doing with Imperial Dramon, just because they're accomplishing some very similar things. Except that Imperial Dramon does get a little bit better thanks to the All-Force starter deck, just adding some really decent blue cards to be working with and adding some extra card draw for what Imperial Dramon could be doing. So I think even though Imperial Dramon did get a little bit worse in a grand meta scheme, he did get better just because, well, everything else got better. It's just that the level of degrees that he got better weren't as good as some of the other decks. And that same sentiment is true with Shoutmon DX. So Shoutmon DX is another really decent deck that came out of BT05, and while it didn't go away, it's just looking a little bit weaker compared to some of the other decks. So Shout DX has two main ways that you want to play it, and both ways are relatively strong, where you could play it one punch style, where you're just trying to build up a really powerful stack with Shoutmon DX and then hit all of the opponent's security, and then use the Blitz ability to try to swing and aggress for the game. And I think the Blitz ability is what's keeping Shoutmon DX around, just because it bypasses a lot of memory deficiencies where the opponent might not be expecting you to be able to attack, and Shout DX actually allows you to attack, along with having some really good control elements that you could be incorporating in the deck, just because Red did get a lot of good control tools, and not only just from the starter deck, but from BT6 as well, so Shoutmon could take advantage of some of those tools to his advantage. But similar to Imperial Dramon, even though the deck did get slightly better, just because there is also the Omnimon-based strategy that you could consider running, where you're going to be using BT01 Omni to just try to swing as many times, because his when attacking ability isn't once per turn, and try to punch the opponent's security that way. He's just too slow of a deck to be using compared to some of his contemporaries, and there are just easier and more efficient ways of doing what he's doing. So if you want to just do a very powerful like control style deck, you could even tech Jesmon to incorporate some of the Gallantmon stuff to add extra control elements into the deck on top of what he was already doing, for no real downside because Gallantmon is also a Royal Knight. So Shoutmon DX, while he's still just a very powerful deck, he's not going to be as good as he once was, just because there are better decks to play that are doing almost the same thing that he's doing. Next, we have Rookie Rush. So I was kind of hesitant on putting Rookie Rush to tier 3, but after thinking about it, there's just more tech encounters and control elements and tools that just beat out what Rookie Rush is trying to do. Rookie Rush's core strategy is still very, very powerful, where you're just trying to build this very big board state and then try to make a big push or swing turn, but with the current top decks in the meta, that's just looking to be less viable of a strategy, just because there's actual ways to interact and deal with wider boards now. So even though Rookie Rush, like all of the other tier 3 decks that I'm going to be talking about, did get slightly better, it's just not good enough to keep it at a higher tier level. Like, it's still a very good deck just because it's taking advantage of the opponent ever whiffing or bricking. So anytime the opponent is ever so slightly off of their game, Rookie Rush could start capitalizing relatively hard on their mistakes, and that's kind of just the power of Rookie Rush, where it's trying to capitalize on the mistakes, but in a format where there's going to be less and less of those mistakes. Mistakes will still happen, don't get me wrong, but when players will know how to play around it and make less mistakes as a whole, Rookie Rush will just see less and less viable play. Next, we have Diaboromon. So Diaboromon is basically another deck where it gets a lot better just because Black gets better as a whole, and they even have the new promo Kurisarimon to add some extra resilient elements into the deck. But again, there's just better things to be doing, and even though I think the two variants on Diaboromon are still just very, very strong, because he is kind of like a counter meta deck, it's just the fact that he is not as strong as some of the other decks, just hold him back because you really need to have your Diaboromon on the field in order for the Diaboromon deck to do anything. And if you can't get into that Diaboromon, or when you do get into that Diaboromon, you can't utilize him hyper efficiently, then the deck kind of does just stumble and fall over, even though it does get a little bit better just because, like I said, black as a whole gets a little bit better. So it's just still a pretty solid deck no matter which of the two variants you build. You could build either the One Punch variant where you're using the promo Diaboromon to just spawn lots of tokens and punch the opponent's security as hard as you possibly can. I think that's not as good, but it's still decent. Just because one punch strategies are always going to be good, I think that based on the current meta, maybe playing BT02 Diaboromon and trying to go for more resilience might be towards the deck's benefit. So even though he does have two very solid builds, it's just, again, he's not doing as strong of things as some of the other decks, because if you want a deck that's spawning lots of bodies and being extra resilient, then you might as well just play D Brigade because it's also a very aggressive style of deck. Next, we have Shine Greymon. So Shine Greymon is just another really solid deck that doesn't really seem to go away, and Shine Greymon, with all of its different builds on what supporting mega you could use, is still just a solid deck to be incorporating just because it's very hard to be interacting with tamers right now. There's borderline almost no tamer interaction in the game. Well, there's just a small handful of cards, but only one of those small handful of cards is being used in very specific colors, so that means playing your tamers is going to be relatively safe, and Shine Greymon capitalizes and has easy ways to play the tamer. Yellow as a whole got a little bit of some boosts just because they got a reinforced memory boost to try to rig their security, so you could try to rig your tamers in your security while drawing a card and healing at the same time. So that's looking to be very powerful, on top of the fact that you have Wyvern's Breath to add some extra big control tools that are even more efficient than what Shine was using before. So Shine is just another still control style deck where it's trying to take advantage of the long game, where the longer the game goes, the more powerful Shine will get because he'll have more memory to be working with, and with more memory, there's more powerful things that you can do with him. So it's just a really solid late game style deck, but because the game is in a state where there's just a lot more early game aggression, especially harder hitting early game aggression, or once they get a really good stack and start steamrolling, then it's really hard for Shine Greymon to come back if he doesn't have the proper setup. And then the last deck on tier 3 is going to be Grand Kawagamon OTK. So Grand Kawagamon OTK is basically just doing what every other OTK deck is doing, where you're just trying to hit the opponent's security as hard as you possibly can, and I do think that's always going to be a very powerful and timeless strategy, considering, well, how many decks on this have the ability to OTK, and how many are good at doing their OTK are two very important factors. So the fact that Grand Kawagamon is still just one of the better OTK style decks means it could still stay meta relevant for quite some time, and if they ever print cards that help its OTK strategy out even more, then it'll just get more powerful and keep staying meta relevant because of that. So I think OTK decks as a whole are just that powerful, and, well, Grand Kawagamon is just one of the better green decks we could be using for that aspect. Next, on to tier 4, we're going to be having Chaos Gallantmon. So Chaos Gallantmon is still a pretty solid deck to be using, it's just not as good as it once was, just because the meta, well, obviously is changing to make him not as good. Like, purple as a whole gets some really good tools, and there's lots of different ways to be playing the deck, but I do think that what he's doing is just inherently too slow. He's trying to control the field, and even though we do get more control elements to be using, I think that he's not as good as he once was, just because he's, well, too slow at using what he's doing. So even though he's still just a very solid deck to be using as a whole, because he is kind of like a purple toolbox control style deck, it's just not going to be quite fast enough compared to some of the other decks, and like I mentioned before, Titamon does almost the exact same thing but better and more consistent, just because you have easier ways to set up Titamon, keep reusing Titamon's ability over and over again, and have very powerful other plays that you can make, because Titamon allows you to use on-play abilities where Chaos Gallantmon does not. So it's just a still solid deck, but just not as good as Titamon. Next, we have Dan Devimon. So Dandevimon is another deck where it's a pretty solid deck to use. There's a couple of different ways to use it. You could use it with the Chaos Gallantmon package, or you could use it with the Myrmicuse Ornismon package to basically try to spawn multiple megas off of your 1 megas on delete ability. So I think like that's still just a pretty solid strategy to be using, but it is just a relatively slow deck, and even though we do have cards that, thanks to Titamon's package, to help speed the deck up, it's just still not going to be fast enough compared to some of the other decks. But when it does go off, it is very, very devastating because you could do a lot off of whatever megas you're going to be spawning, depending on the build and variant that you're going to be incorporating. Then you also could play him kind of Megazoo style as well, just because Megazoo is still a relatively okay style of deck. There are just more tools in various other Megazoos that might just be better as a whole to use than Dandevi Megazoo, but regardless, the whole idea that you're going to be spawning multiple megas off of your 1 megas on delete ability is what's making the deck very good. It's just, again, slower than everything else on the list that's above him. Next, we have Plutomon. So Plutomon, I was kind of hesitant on putting Plutomon here, but I think Plutomon has lots of unknown factors that could make him actually really, really good. So I think the Wizardmon promo actually helps out the deck immensely, making Plutomon way more playable, and we do have lots of really good options that we could use in combos with Plutomon, similar to how you want to play Lilithloop. So you could just play Lilithloop, which is like why I put Plutomon as a tier 4 deck, because, well, they're doing very similar things. Being able to play your options hyper efficiently to gain lots of value to then use Omnimon Swart to just combo and do even more shenanigans, but I feel like Lilithmon is just the better of the two at doing that type of strategy. But to Plutomon, the fact that he does have his own and has lots of unknownness to him could make him a really good deck to be playing around with still. And for that similar reason, I'm also putting Purple Metal Garurumon, just because the deck didn't go away because we have Bellastarmon to help complement what the deck is trying to do. So we have lots of 7-costed options that we could take advantage of with Purple Metal Garurumon to just not only control the field, but spawn a bigger field, and we even have more level 4 Digimon that we could be interacting with him, that we could actually utilize some of their abilities like Rush in order to gain some really good aggression. So he's just another very flexible and versatile deck, but he does require, for the most part, relatively specific setups and combos in order to be really, really good, and I think that time is something we don't necessarily have a whole lot of, making him just a relatively weaker deck than some of the others, but he's still just a pretty solid deck to be thinking about playing with, just because Bellastarmon, again, supports him in a very good way to make him more viable than he was before. Next up, we have War Greymon. So this is the Yellow War Greymon, and I guess this is kind of like Yellow War Grey, Mastimon, Dynasmon, just yellow good stuff as a whole, just because yellow in the set is supporting the fact that we are gaining benefit for reducing our own security. So War Greymon, Mastimon, and Dynasmon all play off of that sub-theme, and it makes our cards even more powerful and efficient than they were. It's just, again, if you're going to be playing a premier yellow deck, then Lord Nightmon just does the same type of thing, but better, but you do get various other tech and tools that Yellow War Grey offers that Lord Nightmon can't necessarily use, and War Greymon is still just a pretty solid card to be using in his own right, just because, again, all of the new synergy and support that Yellow got as a whole just help what he's doing, making him still a very good deck to be playing around with the correct build. And then the last deck I'm going to be highlighting on this list is going to be Eosmon. So I think Eosmon is easily the worst deck to come out of BT6, and even though it's a pretty bad deck, it's still a deck that people want to use, and it is a deck that people are going to use, and it's not like it's that bad. It's doing just everything else that every other deck is doing on a basic fundamental level. It has some solid removal, some solid aggression potential to hit the opponent's security. It has some solid ways of spawning free bodies and free value to like reuse your high level Digimon. So like it's not a bad deck by all means, it's just not what green wants to be doing, and it really diluted a lot of the green tools in the set, making green as a whole slightly worse in BT6. So it's not like it's a bad deck, it's just not a great deck either. Just because, again, if you're trying to play more of a control style deck, you might as well be playing Nidhogg, and if you're trying to punch the opponent's security really hard, you might as well just be playing Grand Kawagamon. So that's kind of like what, as a whole, the lower tiers are doing, where it's just like you could play these decks, or you could play decks that are doing the exact same thing but better with some of the higher tier ones. So I think all of these decks are still relatively meta competitive and meta viable. It's just how meta viable is based on their tier, and I think there's still just a lot of depth and diversity that I'm not even covering just because we still have lots to explore with BT6, but I guess we don't have that much time with BT6 considering Classic Collection is just around the corner, and in Tier 5 is that unknown where everything else is just beneath these decks, and I think these are the more definitively better decks to be playing. Like, you could still play some of the old BT5 decks and incarnations of BT5 decks, so like there's still just a lot that you could play, and there is a lot to play. It's just I think that compared to everything else, nothing is quite as good as what I have listed here. But again, this is just all my opinion on what I think BT6 is going to look like. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.